Hello. Thank you for the introduction, Brenda, and thank you for having me here. As Brenda said, my name is Tala Fakhouri. I'll be talking about AI use in drug development. You may have heard about the AI work that's happening on the devices side of the equation, which is really exciting. Our colleagues at CDER have really set the stage for policy development in that area, but today we're going to focus specifically on drugs. So there are a few take-home messages that I hope you'll be able to take from today's presentation. I'm going to go through these learning objectives. The first thing that we're going to do, we're going to talk about AI use across different stages of drug development. So we'll go through some examples in discovery, non-clinical, clinical, and so on. Then we're going to talk about FDA's experience with AI in regulatory submissions. You'll also hear more about that in one of the sessions tomorrow. After that, we'll talk about some policy milestones when it comes to AI in drug development. So we'll talk about what CDER has been doing to kind of promote the responsible use of these technologies. And after that, we'll talk specifically about the work that we're doing to address the executive order that was signed by President Biden on October 30th last year, which has specific mandates as it relates to AI in medical products, specifically for drugs. Then we'll talk about some immediate and long-term next steps or future directions for this work. You're probably all familiar with AI use. You probably use ChatGPT or some form of a generative AI in your daily life or in your work. But AI has also been used in medical research for many years now. And this is really just meant to illustrate this increase in the use of AI in medical research generally. On this slide it shows PubMed search results. If you just go in and type mesh terms for AI, generative AI, large language models, and you look at the number of publications from 2016 until 2022, you could expand it to whatever year you want, you'll see this really rapid growth in the number of publications in medical research using AI. And there are many reasons behind this phenomenon. We're not going to discuss that today, but briefly, a part of the reason is the availability of large data sets. So generally, AI needs large data. So you could think there's a lot of EHRs, claims data, data from registries, data from clinical trials, multimodal data, right? Data from wearables or genomics data. Proteomics data, data from imaging, the availability of these large amounts of data, different types of data set really enabled that technology. Importantly, increases in computational power has really pushed the field forward and advancements in methods. So if you think about methods, you could think about more traditional machine learning methods. And then on the other end, you have generative AI or large language models. This advancement in sophisticated methods has really accelerated the adoption of these tools in medical research. Now, we see what's happening in the outside world also reflected specifically for drug development. On this slide is some examples of AI uses across different stages of drug development, starting with discovery, moving to non-clinical research, clinical research, and pharmaceutical manufacturing and post-market safety surveillance. So when you think about discovery, AI use in discovery, it could be that AI is being used to identify a drug target, to select a drug target, identify protein folding, identify ideal or optimal targets to be tested in a clinical trial. There's so much work happening in that area, and it's really accelerating a lot of these upstream steps before you even enter into a clinical trial. In fact, during my graduate work, some graduate students would spend 6 to 8 years identifying how a protein folds, right? That would be their PhD dissertation. Now you can use some tools that may be able to do that for you in a year and a half. This is how fast this technology can move things forward. A lot of that work that happens in discovery is usually outside of FDA's oversight. We know it happens. Sponsors tell us about it because they're very interested in the use of the technology, but it's not something that we would be looking at carefully. After these drugs are identified, or targets for a therapeutic is identified, then it's going to enter through the traditional non-clinical research, identify, PK, PD, toxicology studies, dose range finding. That's also where we see applications of AI. And then the largest proportion from what FDA sees on our end is in clinical research. So we get asked, can you tell me more about how AI is being used in clinical trials? It could be things like identifying sites. So you might have a lot of data to identify what are the sites that are ideal for my clinical trial. Then you could also use it to identify the optimal or ideal patients to be recruited into your trial. You could also enhance adherence in a trial using machine learning or AI tools. Of course, for data collection, what that means, it could be a wearable, right? A lot of wearables, a lot of digital health technology tools are AI enabled. So they'll be able to process large amounts of information, collect information, and provide kind of a digital biomarker for a clinical trial. Of course, there's also analysis of RWD, or creation of EHR phenotypes from real world data from RWD. That's another use case. And as I mentioned, in clinical endpoint assessment. Additionally, AI can be used in these later phases of the drug development process in manufacturing, right? Advanced manufacturing actually is a prime target for AI because this is where a lot of automation can happen. So we know that machine learning is being used a lot in that area. And then, of course, for post-market safety surveillance, so AI can be used to detect or evaluate or process signals as it relates to adverse events. And that's one of the applications of AI. So this is kind of the spectrum of where this tool is being used, which makes it really interesting to be able to provide general frameworks that could apply across all of these different stages. That's why we always emphasize that your evaluation, our evaluation of these methods have to be really anchored in the context of use. How are you using AI? What is the scope and role of your model across the phases of drug development? And then, it also has to be risk-based or risk-informed, as I'll discuss in other slides. So in 2023, our colleagues in the Office of Clinical Pharmacology published a landscape analysis, a paper that described FDA's experience with submissions that include AI and machine learning components. And I want to emphasize this is what we receive in-house. This is not necessarily reflective of what's out there because we know that the uses are wider outside of regulatory submissions. The paper, as I said, described the uses across different parameters. On the top of this slide, you're going to see the submission that included AI ML by submission type. So whether it was an IND, an NDA, a submission to the Drug Development Tools Program, for example, or a CPIM meeting submission. From 2016 to 2021, we're updating these numbers, but the paper was published last year with the range of 2016 to 2021. On the bottom of that table, you'll see the submission by the drug development stage. So discovery, preclinical or non-clinical, clinical research, and post-market safety monitoring. What you'll see is kind of representative of that first image that I showed you, where you see this kind of exponential growth. In 2016, we had one IND with an AI ML component. In 2021, we had 128 submissions with AI ML components. So the number of submissions and the complexity of the submissions is increasing. When you look by drug development stage, most of what we get is in clinical research. But again, I want to acknowledge that a lot of what's out there is actually in discovery. But these are submissions that come into the agency, whether it's in an IND or a meeting request. We also looked in that paper at the submissions by therapeutic area. So here is kind of a distribution of different therapeutic areas where these types of tools are being used. And the largest proportion is in oncology, psychiatry, gastroenterology, and so on. But it really traverses multiple different therapeutic areas. So it's not restricted to just one thing. Now, we get asked a lot this question about how will FDA regulate AI? I just want to clarify that really our role is to ensure, and Dr. Cavazzoni mentioned this in the morning, is to advance the responsible adoption of these emerging technologies to accelerate the development of safe and effective drugs that can really help patients that need these therapies. So you can kind of think about this technology, artificial intelligence and medicine on one side, and advancing regulatory science, tipping the scale towards patient benefit. So we want to promote the responsible use of this technology to make sure that it is being used robustly in a way that we can rely on it to give us the evidence needed to approve a specific drug. Now, in the past several years, we've been working on AI, and I actually now wish I had another slide that shows the CDRH AI policy milestone. So that's for devices, but because we work very closely with our devices colleagues, they've kind of set the stage for a lot of regulation, not just in the US or regulatory policy, not the US, but globally, as it relates to AI in medical products. But we started this work in 2019. So in 2019, CDER established the AI Steering Committee. And the role of the steering committee was really to try to come up with a strategy, an internal strategy for AI use across the center, to have a unified voice in explaining the work that we're doing, and kind of developing our thinking over the next few years as it relates to AI in regulatory policy. A part of the AI subcommittee was the AI framework work group. And that group was specifically tasked with developing a regulatory framework, a regulatory thinking around AI in drug development. And that's the main focus of that group, was actually to write discussion papers that ended up being published last year in May of 2023 to solicit feedback and to learn from the outside world, not just sponsors, biotech, academia. A lot of this work is actually done by academia, by biotech, by smaller types of companies rather than large pharmaceutical companies. So wanted to engage with external parties on how they're using that technology and on specific questions that we raised in the discussion paper that I'll show you briefly. So 2019, we developed these groups. At the end of 2022, we had an expert workshop with Duke Margolis, where we again invited speakers from academia, biotech, industry, other regulators, because we know that harmonization globally is a very important point. So we had a discussion around several topics, including governance, accountability of the use of AI models, issues related to data quality. So these models are just as good as the data used to train them. So we wanted to talk about the availability of data. Is there good data out there in the healthcare setting to help promote the use of that technology for drug development? And then we also wanted to ask about model performance. What are people doing to assess the performance of these models in their drug development programs or in their research? The Duke Margolis workshop and then the discussion paper, we published actually two. One that looked at drug development overall in all phases: discovery, non-clinical, clinical, post-market, manufacturing. Another discussion paper was just focused on manufacturing because the uses there are a little different, and with some unique challenges and considerations. Happy to discuss this further later. These two discussion papers, the expert workshop, and then our experience with regulatory submissions that I just showed you, kind of helped us set the stage for what's coming next, right? So now we've gained kind of this experience, and we got this information from external parties. We can now start developing a robust regulatory framework moving forward to advance the responsible use of that technology. And then the executive order came out. So it's perfect timing. The executive order came out, like I said, in October. I don't know if I have a pointer here. I think I do. Okay, great. So at the end of last year, and in it, there were specific requirements for CDER, for drugs. And we are currently this year responding to that. We were actually given 365 days from the time the executive order was signed to push out certain deliverables. I'll mention briefly what we've been doing to address the executive order, but primarily we published a white paper recently in March of this year. I'll talk about that briefly, that describes how the medical product centers are working together to advance the responsible use of this technology. And then we have a city workshop, so Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative workshop. If you actually Google City, FDA, AI, and drug development, it will be August 6th. It's going to be a hybrid workshop, so there are limited seats available for you to attend in person, but you could also join online. I encourage you to sign up. In the workshop, we'll have experts speak using use cases. So we want it to be practical and helpful. These are the specific unique challenges that we face with AI, and here are some proposed ideas or solutions. That will be the focus of that workshop in August. And then this year, we also hope to publish our first AI guidance for drug development. And I'll walk through some of these milestones in the next few slides. Okay. So Executive Order 14110 on safe, secure, and trustworthy development of AI. The executive order really launches a government-wide effort to guide responsible AI development and deployment across the federal government. And what's really great about this is that it's not demanding that the government's approach to AI is horizontal, meaning it's not going to be the same across all industries. Instead, each agency will develop its own thinking and regulatory frameworks. It's more vertical, which is great. It includes 150 requirements, and these requirements range from developing guidelines and frameworks to conducting studies, creating task forces, issuing recommendations, and even engaging in rulemaking. So a wide range of different requirements for all agencies within the federal government. Then there's specific language for drugs and devices. We work very closely with our colleagues at CDRH, with CDER, of course, and then the Office of Combination Products to make sure that our approach is consistent where possible. And I'll get into more detail on that shortly. Like I said, for drugs, we have 365 days to be able to develop our thinking, specifically as it relates to, this is language directly from the EO, define the objectives, goals, and high-level principles required for appropriate regulation throughout each phase of drug development. So the first thing that we did is we kind of wanted to explain on a high level, what is the work that we are doing, all of the medical product centers as it relates to AI. And this is very, very important. We actually get feedback on that. Like I'll show you in the next few slides too, based on feedback we received on the discussion paper. People want to make sure that we are consistent where possible with how our devices colleagues are handling AI in devices, right? The approaches may be different in regulation between the two centers, but generally you could think about principles for good machine learning practice, just general principles should pretty much be the same regardless of what the medical product is. So we wanted to be able to articulate how the medical product centers are working together, and we published this paper with 4 areas of focus. In the first section of the paper, we talk about how we intend to continue to foster collaboration to safeguard public health. Then in the second section of the paper, we talk about our plans to advance the development of regulatory approaches. In it, we announce the AI guidance that's coming out for drugs, but also there are 2 guidances from CDRH that will be published this year. One is draft to final guidance on predetermined change control plans. It's really great guidance. I encourage you all to read it. And then there's another guidance that will be coming out from CDRH on life cycle maintenance of AI models. And then, of course, there's the CDER specific guidance that we're publishing this year. We also talk about our efforts to develop harmonized standards. In fact, if you go online and type standards for AI, you will see a million different documents out there. And the question is, which standards do I follow? Do we like which specific standard should I accept and adopt for my organization? So we're working on that to try to identify some sort of harmonized standards that we could all follow for medical products development. Then, of course, best practices and tools and so on. And lastly, support research related to the evaluation and monitoring of AI performance. And this is so important for specific use cases. I'll mention manufacturing again. The strength of these tools is they learn, they evolve, they adapt. Whereas generally regulations for drugs are based on a fixed point in time. So there are certain applications where this continuous evolution and training of these models becomes very important, and we need to develop methods to be able to monitor their performance after they've been deployed. Again, this is of critical importance for devices, not so much for drugs, but depends on, again, the context of use. There may be examples where the use in drug development would require this continuous monitoring. You could think about post-market safety surveillance or manufacturing as some examples. Okay, the second deliverable that we're working on is guidance that will be coming out this year. Of course, it's right now deliberative, pre-decisional. I can't share with you what's in the guidance, but I can give you just very high level that this guidance is in collaboration with all of the medical product centers. So we actually, in the writing of this guidance, we have colleagues from devices, from biologics, CDER devices, Oncology Center of Excellence, Office of Combination Products. We're all working on this together. It is informed by the experience of over 300 submissions to date with AI ML components, on over 800 comments that we received on the 2 discussion papers that were published last year, and on the best available or current regulatory science research. We understand that this is an evolving area. So this is going to come out as a draft guidance. We really want and need your feedback. This is how we can make sure that when that draft eventually goes to final, it is really informed by the community's feedback and experience, and thinking through the applicability of this guidance to the work that you all may be doing. So I wanted to end the next few slides with some of the comments that we received on the discussion paper, just to kind of forecast what we hope to accomplish in the future, but also to kind of summarize the feedback that we received for all of you, to see if your questions, your concerns are reflected in some of the comments that we've received. So the discussion papers that we published last year were also written by a collaboration between the medical product centers. And we received over 800 comments from 65 different organizations. When we issued the guidance, it included 3 sections where we solicited feedback: one on human-led governance, accountability, and transparency. What does transparency mean for AI? What is governance? Who's responsible for monitoring the performance of the model after it's being deployed? The second set of questions were around the quality and the reliability and relevance of data used to train and develop these models. And finally, we ended with a set of questions related to model development and performance. And we got a lot of feedback that can kind of be summarized into these themes. The first questions that we got on the discussion paper were, FDA says that that AI is being used across the spectrum of drug development. What is within FDA's scope of regulation and outside of scope, right? So you could think about, again, discovery. You're developing an AI tool to predict protein folding. will FDA regulate that? If I'm a sponsor and I'm using AI to write the first draft of a regulatory submission, is this under FDA's oversight? These are the type of questions that we actually got on the discussion paper. Then we got asked about, what do you mean by risk-based for AI? Can you actually tell us how you would operationalize a risk-based approach for AI? We got questions on transparency. What is the level of detail that will be required in terms of documentation that should be submitted to the agency? There were a lot of calls for harmonization, which is very interesting because we don't have currently global, guidance or regulation. So we need to start by developing some guidelines and guidances before we move to harmonization. But I think it's this expression perhaps of a little bit of anxiety about what's coming next. So we're keeping this in mind. And then, of course, a lot of comments about alignment with AI guidelines that were published by our colleagues at CDRH. And finally, which I actually find very interesting, calls for the establishment of public-private partnerships to create kind of big data lakes, if you want to call it, or a place where people can put their data so that everyone can use that data to develop better models. I think it's interesting that it came to the FDA because, when sponsors submit their data to us, this is protected, it's proprietary. So we are thinking of ways to enable data sharing. This would be something that would be of great value, I think, for all AI tool developers, because in fact, a lot of the data that's out there is kind of biased towards positive trials. But for a lot of machine learning, you need negative trials. You need data that did not actually produce good results to train better models. So these are some of the themes that emerge. We're going to try to address these different questions that we received on the discussion papers and the guidance that we're publishing this year. Okay, so for the short term, we're publishing our guidance this year. We really want your feedback. That feedback will help us develop future guidance or guidances. There may be guidances that are focused on specific areas of drug development. We're also working to develop practices that can be best practices that can be shared across the board. And another important thing is this consistent terminology. So defining what different terms mean is very important in a field like AI. We want to continue, obviously, engaging with external parties. Please sign up for the FDA City workshop if you haven't already. For the long term, we want to continue our responsive risk-based regulation. We hope that AI guidance will kind of articulate that we are open to the use of this technology in a responsible way to advance safe and effective medicines. And then we plan to continue advancing regulatory science. We hope to be able to promote demonstration projects in the future that can help with that step, and continue our collaborative approach by engaging with all players in the AI ecosystem. Okay, now I have two very easy poll questions. They're true or false. The first one, evaluation of machine learning model performance requires an evaluation of the data used to develop the model because these models are data-driven. Who thinks this is true? So if you're evaluating the model, you should evaluate the data used to train the model. Awesome. I see like 60% hands up. Agree. The second question, a risk-based assessment framework, and I skipped that slide, so this is going to be hard for you, but we could do it now, means that the level of oversight, the level of the rigor for the assessment of the performance of these models or the acceptance criteria for these models will depend on the risk that is associated with using AI. Does that sound like a reasonable yes? I see a lot of nodding. Okay. I think they passed, right? Great. I'll take questions now.
Okay, we have just about 8 minutes for questions, so please come up to the mics if you have any questions in-house. And we have one brave person here. Your question, please.
So guidance documents are current FDA thinking, they're not regulation. So in terms of, from the way I'm reading your, interpreting your presentation, there are no true guardrails right now, other than as a sponsor, we would present to you what our risk-based approach is and what our strategy is. And we would kind of do a mommy may I, or are we all in agreement? How's it work?
So the guardrails for drug development will be different. I just want to put that out there, different than guardrails for AI use in other industries, right? So if you think about AI in a self-driving car, obviously that's going to be different. In drug development, we've received over 300 submissions that we've been able to engage and interact with using our current regulatory framework. Our current regulatory framework is robust and is able to handle these submissions that we've received. So we feel like we have the guardrails in place. The questions that we get asked, though, is for AI specifically, when the agency needs to evaluate a submission that comes in with AI. Are you going to review the data used to train the model? Are you going to review the code? Are you going to try to replicate the finding using? So these are the type of guardrails or questions that we get. They're really more questions about, can I trust the results from the way that you use the model? And that's where we hope our guidance can provide some answers to that question.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. We have one other person here in-house, please.
Hi. As you're creating guidance around the use and management of AI models, are you considering some of the recent ISO publications that have just come out to sort of align AI management systems with how ISO is thinking about it?
So specifically for management systems and ISO, I mean, like I said, there are so many standards out there, right? So when we think about eventually developing a set of best practices or standards, we would take into consideration all of these different standards that are out there. For the guidance that we're developing specifically, it's kind of our articulation of our thinking around what is the risk-based regulatory framework that the FDA will take to assess the credibility of these models.
Thank you.
Thank you. Online question, please.
Can you comment on the use of AI by FDA employees, for example, reviewers? How is FDA introducing AI to reviewers to support the review of incoming applications?
That's a great question. So the question is on internal uses of AI. I actually encourage, if you're going to be at DIA this year, there's going to be a session on internal uses of AI by different regulators, including EMA, FDA, and so on. So we do have a lot of experimentation of AI tools happening internally that is meant to really increase the efficiency of the work that we are doing. We are a big organization, just like a lot of organizations out there. But the uses of AI within the agency, we are government, so the uses are different. For example, we can't just bring in ChatGPT and use it within the agency. We house a lot of proprietary data, right? So we have certain set of requirements that are set in place to kind of guardrail that type of information that we have in-house. But this is, this is going to be changing because I didn't talk about that. But in the executive order, there's also a directive to agency to report on their internal uses of these technologies and making the use of that technology public. So we will be reporting just like everyone else within the federal government on how our staff are using AI over the next few years or so.
Thank you. In-house question, please.
To preface, by all means, I'm not an AI expert. I recently got to sit in a roundtable with Brandon Gallos from FDA, and we were discussing possible neural pathways being like another variable to algorithm variability. And I was wondering if there's any initiative from FDA's end to consider those on top of the guidances that are currently in progress.
To use what? I couldn't hear you. Sorry. Can you repeat that?
Oh, so I was wondering, as AI, digital pathology specifically in drug development, as they progress, there are lots of variabilities between different algorithms by developers. And I know as pilots for these digital pathology projects progress, there will be necessity for adding more variables, such as adding a pathologist into the algorithm. And I was wondering, that being a new neural pathway, is that also being considered in terms of FDA's initiative to harmonize these algorithms?
So in that landscape paper that we published last year, we discuss where AI was used in the drug development program. And actually one of the largest uses is in imaging, and one of the largest imaging for drug development is in pathology. For any specific technique that is being used in a specific context of use, our evaluation of that technology will depend on how are you using AI? How much am I relying on AI to come up with the evidence, right? To come up with the answer for the question, if it's supportive or if you're trying to replace a traditional method that is in place. Is it something that we would consider? Of course, we would consider any use of emerging technology that is responsible and robust. I can't give you a specific answer because it would depend on exactly how the technology is being used.
Thank you.
Okay, one last question online, please.
How is the FDA integrating AI with knowledge management, and how could that potentially impact life cycle management of drug products from development to post-marketing?
How is FDA using AI in knowledge management? I would need, honestly, more information on that. I'm not sure if this person is specifically talking about like knowledge graphs, but we receive a lot of submissions where AI is used in different stages of drug development, including AI to kind of predict different outcomes, that integrates information from a trial to use for predicting outcomes. But specifically for our review, I'm not sure I understand that question. So perhaps we can go to another one.
Or some clarification on that question. It's based upon the multiple sources of information they have on drug products, and whether an AI-driven knowledge management approach is something the agency is
I see.
forward to adopting soon.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, right now we're experimenting with different uses of AI internally within the agency. We have to go through different type of milestones to be able to adopt any specific use because of some of the restriction around cybersecurity and our access to these tools. I don't have a specific answer to this, but obviously one of the strengths of AI is this ability to synthesize information from different sources, different modes. So I can't see why we wouldn't be doing that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fakhouri. Dr. Fakhouri.